Okay, chapter 22. Last chapter in the book was a little bit exciting, right? Page 483, real estate investment. Again, the chapter is all math. There is not even a bit of theory in this chapter whatsoever. It's all a math chapter. We want to make sure you're capable of calculating basic profit and loss questions and dealing with things like equity and return on equity. I think folks sometimes in this chapter get caught up in the terminology and thinking there's a bunch of different math. It's really one math formula, folks. The formula for profit and loss is the formula for profit and loss. In your formula packet there, I think it's the very last thing in your formula packet, you have the basic TBar formula for calculating profit and loss. What is that, page 10? Right? It's supposed to be on page 12. Do y'all have page 12?
No.
Well, why do you not have page 12? Gosh, Tracy.
People like that?
You are. All right. Well, let me write down the TBar for you then. All right. So, when you're calculating profits and losses, that's a real good one. When you're calculating profit and loss, you can still use a TBar. Okay? And like most T-bars, you're going to have a rate down here in the right-hand corner. And this is going to be rate of return, we're going to call it. Okay? Rate of return is the same thing as rate of profit, rate of loss, because rate of return can be positive or negative. A negative rate of return just means a loss. Positive rate of return means a profit. Up here on the top, you're going to have dollar profit or loss. And down here on the bottom, you're going to have your original investment. Now, when we talk about finance on the real estate side, or an investment on the real estate side, finance matters. How we pay for things matters. In the beginning, to start here, I want to focus on as if we're paying for everything with cash. We're not going to involve loans here, because loans are going to change the picture from a math standpoint when it comes to real estate investment. So, very simply, if we're talking about profit and loss, we're simply talking about what we paid for the property versus what we sold it for. Does that make sense for you guys? So when we say dollar profit or loss up here, if we purchased the property for, let's say we purchased for $115,000, we sold for $180,000, all right? And we want to know what is our rate of return, what's our profit on that sale? Well, we're looking for right here. Agreed? Mm-hmm. So what does the T-bar say we're going to do? Divide our dollar profit or loss divided by our original investment. Well, they didn't give us our dollar profit or loss, did they? But they gave us what we would need to come up with it. How are we going to come up with our dollar profit or loss in that case?
Subtract the sold minus.
Subtract $180,000 minus $115,000. And so our dollar profit in this case, the profit is 65 grand. Everybody agree with that? So the $65,000 goes over here. And what's our original investment?
115.
115. So if you divide those two, you'll get your rate of return. Remember, anytime you calculate the rate, you're multiplying by what? 100 at the end. So $65,000 divided by $115,000. I get a rate of return of 56.5%. 56.5% profit. on that transaction. Now they could complicate this, but they're not really complicating it. I could say on this same property, what's my annual rate of return if I have a before-tax cash flow of, let's just say $9,000. I'm not changing a thing about my formula over here. They're still asking me for what? Rate of return, right? If they're asking me for my annual rate of return, it's still asking me for rate of return. So that still means it's going to be dollar profit or loss divided by original investment. Well, what's my original investment still? $115,000 still. But now, what's my dollar profit or loss going to be if I want an annual rate of return? It's going to be the money I make annually, right? Which in this case is how much money? $9,000. So if I take $9,000 and divide it by 115,000, that is a 7.8% rate of return annually. See, the math didn't change. The way they asked the question did. Yeah, the first one I said, I bought it for this, I sold it for this, what's my profit on the sale? The second one said, I bought it for this, I operated it and collected this much money every year, what's my annual rate of return? But at the end of the day, it's the same formula, it's the same math. Does that make sense for you guys? Nothing has changed there. Now, man, we can get really super complex with this thing if we bring a loan into the picture. By the way, I'm being sarcastic when I say really super complex. It's not that hard. You just have to think a little bit. Bringing a loan into the picture is going to change one thing. So we'll leave the same stats up here. We'll work with the same property. I'm going to erase everything I filled in on the TBar and get back to the starting point over here. So what if I also told you about this property, that we did an 80% loan-to-value loan when we purchased? Now I'm going back to the first question. What's my profit on the sale? Well, rate of return is always dollar profit or loss divided by the original investment. Would everybody agree with that? Do you agree with that? What's my dollar profit or loss if I bought it for $115 and I sold it for $180? Still $65,000, isn't it? What's my original investment?
80% of 150.
No, 20% of 115,000.
20%.
Ah.
Of 100. How much did I invest,
Gotcha.
folks?
Yeah.
Oh, so you got.
I don't care how much the bank invested.
Okay.
Because when we look at a rate of return from my perspective, I care about how much money came out of my right pocket and went into my left pocket after I sold.
So it's your down payment.
It's my down payment. Another word for down payment at the time of purchase is what? It starts with an E. Equity. That's exactly right. So if I said something real fancy like, what's my return on equity investment? All I'm saying, folks, is what's my profit on the money I invested in this transaction? Does that make sense for you guys? So in this case, my original investment's not going to be what I paid for the property because somebody else invested a lot of that money. My original investment's going to be what my down payment was, which in this case is what, $23,000? Is that right?
23.
So my original investment is $23,000 here. Now, I will point out, this is one of those times where you'll make a silly mistake on an exam. Because you'll take 65,000, you'll do what the TBar says, 65,000 divided by 23,000. That's a 2.8% rate of return, isn't it?
No.
What is it?
The 282.
It's a 282% because anytime you calculate a rate, what do you have to do? Always multiply by 100. And here's where you have to apply common sense, folks. If I invested 23 and I took out 65, that's more than doubling my money. So that means it has to be at least 200%. And yes, they will have 2.8% as an answer choice. As a matter of fact, they almost always on these questions just have answer choices that deal with putting the decimal in the wrong place. 2.8%, 28%, 280%, 2,800%. Those are going to be your 4 answer choices. So, if those are your 4 answer choices, did you even need to pick up a calculator? No, because it's roughly double, right? And they only gave you 1 answer choice that was anywhere close to double. Honestly, sometimes on those profit and loss questions, they really are that easy. If you know, you've got to get the concept. So whenever they talk about return on equity, they're talking about your down payment. If they talk about just straight up profit, they're talking about the total purchase price versus the sales price. But it's the same math either way. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. All right, so that's a profit, and that's a return on equity. We also did an annual return. Could we do an annual return on equity? We did. We did profit overall. We did annual return on overall purchase price. Then we did overall return on equity. Could we do an annual return on equity? Yeah. What would change here? What's our dollar profit or loss if we're doing our annual return on equity?
Before tax.
My before tax cash flow, which is how much? $9,000. What's my investment in this case? It's still the 23 because that's my original equity. So if I wanted to do an annualized return on equity, it would be 9,000 divided by 23,000 is 39% return annually. Pretty good if you can get it. Now let me point something out to you here. Remember, before tax cash flow takes into account paying the mortgage payment, right? We've already paid the mortgage payment when we have a before tax cash flow of $9,000. Because remember, to get to before tax cash flow, you got all the way down to net operating income and then you subtracted out debt service, right? So the point here is that the loan has been taken care of. The property's paid the loan. That's why you can just ignore the loan and act like it doesn't exist. So now I want to talk to you about the idea of leverage. Leverage is the question of whether it makes sense to borrow money or pay cash. And that's not always straightforward. You have to do a comparison. You have to compare the return on your investment as if you paid cash and the return on your investment as if you financed. So let's look at this. When we've calculated all these numbers, let's go back to our annual return, not on equity, but our annual return on the property. We said our annual return was $9,000, right? And actually, let's do it this way. If we got a before tax cash flow of $9,000, let's say we have a net operating income. We'll add a wrinkle in there. NOI. We have an NOI of $21,000. Tell me the difference between NOI and before tax cash flow.
Debt service.
Debt service, right? So if I pay cash for the property, my NOI is how much I put in my pocket at the end of the year, right? Because I don't have a loan to pay them. Does that make sense for you guys? Because net operating income minus debt service is before tax cash flow. And if my debt service is 0, then my NOI and my before tax cash flow are the same number. So let's look at and do a leverage question. I want to know if it makes sense to take out this loan. So here's what I'm going to compare. I'm going to compare what my rate of return is on my investment if I don't have a loan, and what my rate of return is on my investment if I do have a loan. So let's look at the rate of return if I don't have a loan. If I don't have a loan annually, how much money am I making on this property? $21,000. Does everybody agree with that? If I don't have a loan, I'm making $21,000 a year on this property. If I don't have a loan, how much did I invest in this property? $115,000. So, 21,000 divided by 115,000, that is pretty good 18.3% return. So we'll just write that number down over here. That's our cash annual return. Is there anybody who doesn't understand where that number comes from? Is everybody okay with that number? So now what do we want to do? We want to compare that to our what? Annual return as if there's a loan. That's exactly right. So if there's a loan, what did we say our investment was? 20.
And we're doing 80% loan to value?
Yeah, 80% loan to value is 23, right?
Yes.
Our down payment was $23,000. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I wrote it wrong place. $23,000. And what's our profit or loss for the year if we have a loan?
9,000.
9,000. So, 9,000 divided by 23,000. That is, again, we did it before, a 39.1% return. So let me ask you a fairly obvious question. If you're an investor, does it make sense to borrow money to purchase that property, or does it make sense to pay cash to purchase that property? Borrow. Borrow. Much less risk, right? Because I'm only risking how much of my money? $23,000, and I'm getting a much better return on that money. Now, some would say, yeah, but I wanted to invest the whole 115. Well, there ain't nothing stopping you from going buying 5 of them. Right? You go buy 5 of them instead of 1. And instead of getting an 18.3% return on your 115, you end up with a 39% return on the whole 115 because you've invested it in multiple properties. That is called positive leverage. Positive leverage is when borrowing money gets you a greater rate of return than paying cash does. What do you think negative leverage is?
The opposite.
Negative leverage is the opposite, when borrowing money brings a lower rate of return. What do you think is the magic key to leverage and whether it's positive or whether it's negative? What's going to change the debt service dramatically?
The cost of loan.
Interest rates. The question of whether leverage is positive or negative is one that's going to be dictated almost exclusively by what interest rates are at any given time. Interest rates, what they are right now, what do you think the leverage consideration is? Positive or negative?
Positive.
Very positive. Staggeringly positive in most cases. With interest rates what they are right now, it makes sense to borrow every dollar you can if you're on the investor side of things, because the returns are so much greater. I would rather, here's what we're saying in essence. I'd rather make 9,000 off of 23 than make 21 off of 115. That's really what you're saying there, which makes sense. I mean, not only do the percentages say it makes sense, but everything screams it makes sense. It's just much less risk, much greater return. You're spreading the risk out on multiple properties. Even if you do invest the whole thing, you find 5 versus 1. That, anytime you spread your risk out, that's a better, safer investment. Make sense for everybody? That is literally the math you need to know for this chapter. None of that is overly complex stuff. It's that same basic formula repeated and regurgitated over and over and over. All right?